Hi everybody, just setting up my camera, making sure that everything is okay. I hope that you can hear me and it's just making sure that Zoom is working properly because it's having a little bit of a tantrum today with admitting people. So if you've been kicked out of the room, just apologies and try to rejoin again. But it just had, I think it was just a funny moment and it should be working again now. Thank you so much, Ruth. Thank you so much for letting me know you can see me and hear me. That's great to know. And great. Well, we will be starting, properly speaking, in the next 5 minutes. So it's great having you guys here. And the chat is open, is going to remain open for the next few minutes. So feel very free to introduce yourself, say hi, etc., etc. Hi, Lisa. How are you? Thank you so much for joining. Hope you're doing good in Michigan. I'm gonna carry on drinking some water because it's really warm here in Malta. I know I was just complaining a couple of days ago it wasn't warm enough, guys. So I'm not complaining. I'm just adjusting to the temperature change. It's definitely a nice change. Hey, Bianca and Susan, how is the UK treating you? I hope the storm is not doing too much of a number on you. Welcome, Svetlana. How are you? Berlin, one of my favorite places in the whole world. Lucky, lucky you. Hey, oh, wow. Hi from Montreal, from Winnipeg. Here is the Canadian front. Thank you so much for joining. Hey, Julie, how are you? Welcome, Pipa. Oh, hey, Paul, how is Manchester? I I have heard things have stopped being flooded in some places, maybe. I don't know. In case you guys don't know, we've had actually really bad weather in the UK because of Storm Kieran. So it's been quite nasty. Oh yes, the Highlands. How is that going there, Steve? Welcome, Dominic. How are you doing? Wet and windy, I bet. Yes, you will be getting the certificate after the course. All of the certificates and everything else that has to do with the course ending will be sorted by the organizers, by World Virtual Tours, very shortly. So don't worry, you will be hearing from them in the coming sort of, well, not hours because we are already quite late into the day, but shortly after it's properly over, you will receive it. There may be a delay because remember, guys, that you have sort of a week to see the recording still for people that may be catching up. But yes, you will be receiving all of that in due process. Very foggy day here. Oh, I'm sorry, Steve. I will not rub in the fact that we have very nice weather here in Malta. It's great, guys. If I could bring you here, well, in fact, I am bringing you here next week, at least bringing you here, metaphorically speaking. Oh my God, Pippa. Yes, I bet, I bet so. I mean, it was very much the same in Southampton right up until the moment when I got in the plane. In fact, my plane was delayed by an hour and a half because the storm was so bad. We weren't sure if we were actually going to be leaving from London. So I get that entirely. And well, Pippa, come here to Malta. I have a spare sofa bed, so you're welcome to use it. It will be warm, if nothing else, and it's pretty dry. I think it's supposed to rain like one day while I'm here, which seems fair considering how much we've had in the UK. I'll deal with one day of rain. Hey Agnieszka, how are you doing? Thank you so much for joining, and thank you so much everybody that's just been arriving into the talk. Hope you're all doing very good. We were literally just about to get started, so don't worry, you've not missed anything. We have 1 minute to go live properly speaking, and if you're joining us from YouTube, hello, and thank you so much for watching from your homes or from wherever you may be. Hey Rosie, how are you? Welcome from New York, how are you doing? And yes, the tour in Malta is actually, let me tell you exactly when that's happening, guys. It's already in World Virtual Tours, and I will put, the link is coming up in a second, but it's Saturday next week at 4 p.m. Malta time, which is CET. So it will probably be early morning for people in the United States, Canada. just an hour behind in the UK, so 3 p.m. And the reason for that is because it gets dark here by 5 because we are an hour ahead. The nighttime comes close very, very quick. But yes, and I found just the perfect spot for the tour. You're gonna have the best views, or well, one of the best views in the city. I am working on recording in another location so that we can do that as a recorded tour later on in after Christmas. So yes, Malta is coming over your way very, very soon. Hi, Charles. Thank you for joining. And hi, Doreen. How are you doing? I am feeling much better since I'm not being rained on. So don't worry, Doreen. I'm absolutely fine. Hey, from the Midlands. How are you? And Doreen, there has been Zoom has been a tiny glitchy, so try coming in and out of the meeting because it kicked out a couple of people earlier as well. So it may just be a matter in there, but everything should be hopefully working on here. At least the microphone is open, so fingers crossed. Oh my goodness, I'm so glad that you guys and oh wow, you bought the actual. I'm so glad that you bought it. And yes, 782 pages. I did try to warn. It's quite a lot. But anyway, it's time to get started, guys. So, very quick introduction for those watching us now or later, wherever you may be. Thank you so much for joining us on our last talk of this course of understanding the Vikings and their sources. My name is Dr. Lilian Céspedes González, and it's doctor because I have a PhD in history from the University of Winchester, specifically on the Norse, on the Viking Age, which is, of course, the topic of this entire talk and this course so far. Well, this is also over a year now that I've been doing these things with World Virtual Tours, and I'm very, very grateful for all of you that have been following all of these projects that we have. As you know, the Free Academy project, as well as all of the other tours and talks we do in World Virtual Tours, is all funded through your donations via PayPal and Stripe. You have in the chat now the link for the donations, and also at the bottom you have as well the link for the upcoming tours, including the tour in Malta, which we're doing exactly in a week's time. So I hope to see you there, and I promise you the views and the history of this place will not disappoint you. But in any case, we have also in there the rota all the way until the end of December. So for those of you that were following the Golden Age of Spain, we are finishing before the end of the year, and we have a few other places like a rerun of our walk through Lisbon, and of course my brand new course, which starts on the 23rd of this month, which is the Normans and their worlds. So if you want to learn more about the Middle Ages, I invite you to join us there. And well, we're doing things a little bit different today. The chat is going to remain open for a little while because I have some questions that I would like to ask and I would like to hear from you. And then we will close it so I can finish off the contextual session, and then we'll open it up again. So the chat is open and we will continue doing this. Thank you so much, Polly. It's very kind. And now, of course, without any further ado, I will start sharing my screen so we can have a quick rundown of these few things that we need to before we get started. So let's get Zoom a moment to catch up. Excellent. So let's go. So just to remind you, we've already have the first 3 sessions. So today is the last class of the course. If you've not been able to catch up with everything, let us know and we'll see what we can do. If you need any help after class or you have any questions, whatever, drop us an email in my personal email address and I'll be more than happy to assist. And if you need the link to the rest of the courses that we have running, whether it's the art history or the new upcoming one on the Normans, you have them there as well in the Free Academy. Right. And since the chat is open, I would like to open up the floor to ask you guys these 2 questions. What is something that you thought or knew about the Vikings or the Norse before we started this course that has now changed or that has been demystified? I would love to hear your answers. Like I said, the chat is open. And also I would like to know which sources of the 3 that we've been reading you thought was the best, or maybe it connected with you better, or perhaps you learn from the most. So let me know your thoughts on those two subjects before we move on into the contextual lecture. So for the sake of understanding, when I mean contextual, we have been talking about several subjects over the last couple of weeks. So today what we're going to be doing is rounding those up with further context to understand those details. But in any case, I'll see what you guys have to say about these two questions, Mocha. That the Norse were quite socially evolved. Well, Mocha Joe, I'm so excited that you noticed that, because yes, that's that's quite literally what I spend my whole life trying to convince people about, that they are not just inhumane raiders, savages, and destroying people left, right, and center. They had quite a developed society, and in fact, on the purpose of that specifically, one of the slides I'm going to be sharing with you guys in a moment talks about their society a bit more, because we've not really delved into that as much as we could perhaps with the sources. So more on that just a moment. I am surprised at their understanding of, yes, 100%. I think particularly with the readings that we have from Havamal, right? It's very interesting, I think, how a lot of the proposed ways of acting can still be very applicable to our modern day society. I mean, I appreciate most of us may not live in a cabin out of the woods where a stranger may knock on the door at any point, and you may need to be, a bit quick, sharp-minded, and on your wits. But a lot of this advice it can still apply to the way you relate to others, to the way you treat guests in this day and age. Considering we are in holiday season, if you're celebrating whatever you're celebrating, I hope you're enjoying it. But hospitality is an important aspect of nature, in terms of our human nature, the community element, etc., etc. So yes, 100% agree. Agnieszka, in fact, in my view, hasn't changed much. Fair enough, but that's good. I'm glad that at least that has reinforced some ideas. And you love the Poetic Edda and the Norse mythology. Of course, I think it is very strange, very intricate, but very interesting as well. So I'm glad that you found those. By the way, at the end of the lecture, I have some further reading recommendations, so I'll get on to those later. But I'm glad that we are getting to those. Dominic, the saga of the Greenlanders. I'm curious that you found that the most interesting, or the one that you learned most from. But honestly, it's one that has always resonated with me, because it's just ordinary day-to-day life kind of thing, despite involving several discoveries. I think I completely get it. They seem more three-dimensional than is portrayed. Yes, I am so glad that you mentioned that, because I think, and 100%, particularly films, I think in films often they just kind of have this one particular viewpoint. There are some films and some TV shows and books about the Norsemen that I would quite happily recommend, and that I may have mentioned before, to bring them more to 3D kind of people. If you are up for a very meta kind of film, The Northman is actually a very good film. The reason why that film didn't do very well in box office is because it's so different from any other kind of Norse Viking narrative that most people would be used to. So it really caught a lot of people off guard. But I think now that you guys have engaged with some of the sources, many of you would be able to appreciate the realities and the drive of the Northman in a completely different way. Otherwise, and if you're up for some comedy in the mix, there is a series on Netflix. It's actually produced by a Norwegian crew. I know them, which is called Norsemen, and it's 3 seasons. And although it approaches things from a comedic perspective, from the point of view of the reality of people and engaging with characters, it's very true to how day-to-day life and ordinary people would have been in Norse times. So those are a couple of recommendations to get away from the cliche Hollywood kind of idea. I enjoyed reading the Saga of the Greenlanders, and it showed, yes, bravery and curiosity for sure. And we're going to be talking a bit more about that bravery and curiosity today. So I'm glad you brought that up, Steve. Oh, Sarah, the Greenlanders as well. I can see that the Greenlanders have fought, their way into your heart, guys. I'm so proud. And yes, exactly, the engagement with the actual archaeological evidence and the literary evidence that we have is great. Spirit, the chivalry on the honesty, very, I guess, very big of a contradiction against the typical image of the Vikings, right? For sure. The visits to Scandinavia also. Well, Agnieszka, this is something else that I was gonna say. And not just to Scandinavia, but to any place that has Norse or Viking heritage, and I'll talk about that more in a moment, would really give you guys an ability to connect with it from a different perspective. But Scandinavia particularly, because I think, unfortunately, a lot of the time, even in places where the Norsemen have engaged with other cultures, there is still a very sort of Anglo-centric curated view of them as ancestors or whatever they are. And it seems to be a bit pigeonholed sometimes. We suffer a lot from it in England and, well, in the UK overall, in the British Isles, I think because of the later narratives that come out in the 19th century for nation making and what our heritage should be. So yeah, going outside, going and engaging with the Norse in Scandinavia will definitely give you a different view. I was aware of women. Yes, well, excellent. The exploration of them in North America was very crucial, as I'm sure you'll notice with Freydis and the rest. Havamal, excellent. I'm glad that the wisdom came through. The Julie, the room is open, so they should be able to come in, no problem. So I don't know. Like I said, there has been a couple of issues with Zoom today, not letting people join in or like letting them join in and kicking out. So if that's the case, the best thing to do is just reload Zoom. So just saying in case anyone else is in the same situation. Well, Beverly, we're going to be talking a bit more about that influence in just one moment. So bear with me one second. And Bianca, I'm so glad that you know Norseman. It's hilarious, I promise. Marion, I'm definitely enjoying this beautiful country. And what about the Vikings sailing to America? Well, we're going to be talking about that more just now. So as we have some very good answers to this, I'm going to close the chat temporarily so we can get some more discussion going, and then I'll open it again for more questions. So I'm now gonna get into sort of like lecturing mode, I guess. Not that I'm ever really lecturing at you guys, but anyway, let's unpack some of those things you guys have been saying and that we've been discussing over the last few weeks. Like, what does Viking even mean? Like, what is it? I hope that by now, through all of the things that we've been learning about and the stories that you've been reading, you will move away from calling them Vikings, because the real word we should be using is Norse or early Nordic societies or Northmen or whatever you want, but not Viking. And the reason for that is because being a Viking is a very specific thing. The word Viking or Vikingr, which is what I've put there for you guys on the slide, we are not even entirely sure what it comes from in terms of where it appears for the first time. We have some evidence from it in Old Icelandic deriving from Old Norse, and it comes from the idea of Vik, V-I-K, which means literally bay, and ingir is a motion verb that kind of means going somewhere or being in motion at the sea. So by putting the verb together, bay, in motion at the sea, it seems to signify those raiding parties that would leave to do their duties. But we know that, oops, sorry, I pressed the button at the wrong time. But we know that the actual, hang on, Zoom has enabled the waiting room and I need to disable it again. Hopefully that will sort out the problem. My apologies for this. Like I said, it's been a bit temperamental today. But the idea is that when you were raiding, you were only doing that seasonally. You weren't going out raiding all the time. And more importantly, you were only raiding as a temporary activity. When you finished your raiding, you went back home and you carried on being a farmer or a craftsman or whatever you were. So people were only Vikings for a short period of time. And in fact, being a Viking is not something that you are, it's something that you do. In the same way that, you could go to war and that doesn't necessarily make you a soldier for life. You were just fighting for your country, if you see what I mean. So that's why we should move away from it. Because calling all of these people in these societies Vikings means that we are excluding everybody that stayed at home, which is the vast majority of the population. So, that's a serious problem. So Norse, Northmen, in general, those kind of words are a lot more inclusive and move away from the stereotype of these two-dimensional beings that we were talking about. And they also allow us to understand that, the Norse are not a monolith. It's not one single point of view. Here in the slide, you have all the different places in Europe, and I'm sure you can see the arrow heading up past the European settlements that show all the places the Vikings went to as Vikings or as Norsemen settlers. A lot of these places may be just raids, for example, some places around the Mediterranean or in Francia. So, that is specific Viking raiding activity, but the rest of the map is Norse colonies. So we start with the ancestral homelands, as I call them, which are Denmark, Sweden, and Norway. And then, the world was quite literally their oyster. They went to the British Isles, which I argue is one of the most successful colony of Norsemen ever. We have the Kingdom of Normandy, of which we're going to be talking a lot more in my Norse, in my first lecture, which is how the Norse settled in Normandy in the new course. So if you're interested in seeing how the Normans developed from being Northmen, that would be one for you guys for sure. Then we have all of the trades that go over to the east, to the area of the Rus. Some of you may have caught before in World Virtual Tours with me my talk on Olga of Kiev, which essentially discusses how all of those states that were originally trading outposts through the Volga down to Byzantium were original Norse colonies. And then we have, of course, Iceland, Vinland, Greenland, etc., etc. These people mingled with the places that they went to. That's also the reason why we have a big issue understanding how or to what extent they settled in certain places, like, for example, in Finland or in other places around the Baltic. It's only been very, very recently that we have started accepting as academics that there were Norse settlements in Estonia, in Latvia, in Lithuania, in Poland. In fact, one of the most successful Viking settlements in the Baltic was Polish. So it's interesting how we're still moving past that. But it's because we need to understand that being Norse is not just being born in early medieval Scandinavia. It's assuming that culture, that way of life, and behaving accordingly. So it's very much the idea of to be or not to be, which is ironic since Hamlet is actually based on a Norse saga from the 11th century, in case you want to go and check that out. Shakespeare did not entirely make all of that up. He had a little bit of inspiration. So for the Norse, identity is fluid and it's often very geographically based, but always based on core principles like their independence, their sense of adventure, their sense of heroism, and the sense of generally democratizing society to a certain extent. Well, let's talk a bit more about this society, right? Because you said they were democratizing it, but well, there were some issues. We've not talked a lot about the structure of Norse society in these talks, and I thought it would be important, particularly as you're on your way to discover new things about the Northmen, to establish what this society was like. Well, like any society, Norse society was full of intricacies. So, we cannot really discuss all of those intricacies here right now in a few moments. But overall, there was a general hierarchy, at least at a certain moment in time, that was based on either your birth, your general status, your occupation, meaning your professional ties, and things like that. And overall, these aspects were seen as crucial for society to function harmoniously. And there is a lot of emphasis in this. Think about the environmental conditions upon which these people throughout the majority of the Norse world would live in. We're talking of landscapes where life is hard, particularly in the ancestral homelands. Even moving over to the British Isles, it's not like Orkney is much nicer than, the south of Norway from that perspective. Or, even far away in Iceland, Finland, etc., they were always encountering challenging living circumstances. That's the reason why some settlements will be more successful than others, or why their mingling with the locals can completely change the way they behave. But overall, in traditional Norse societies, we have three main social strata, or to call them something like that. They are not exactly strata, but three main roles in hierarchy. We have the Jarls, the Carls, and the Thralls. Everything with an A just to make things easy to remember. Now, the Jarls, I'm sure you've heard of this before. It's actually the same word from what we get the concept Earl in English. And they are essentially the ruling elite. They are kind of nobility, though not necessarily nobility as seen in the rest of Europe. These people were often associated with the warrior cult, with the world of honor and power through that honor. And often they are related, of course, to the mythical heroes of the sagas that you've learned about. So if you're a Jarl that descends from Sigurd himself, obviously you're a good guy, if you see what I mean. That kind of idea. The concept of lineage and family ties is super important in Norse society, alongside with that honor and heroic action. Because if you follow the readings of Havamal and you behave accordingly, and through your family line, everyone has behaved accordingly, then you build a reputation, and your reputation will succeed you afterlife. That's why it's important that these people follow a certain code of conduct, right? Well, overall, though, the purpose of a jarl was mostly to be in charge of a territory for the sake of administration, defense, and governance. So they are not exactly like kings, they are kind of more like smaller magnates. We do encounter some kings and some royal lineages in different parts of the Norse world, but that often comes from their mingling with other cultures or with very specific circumstances in those geographical locations. Well, then we have the Carls, which essentially means any other person who is just a free man. And in fact, the concept Carl and freeman as a surname comes from the exact same perspective. So the Carls are the base of society. They are the backbone of everything that happens in a community. They are the craftsmen, the farmers, the merchants, and other warriors that are not part of the elite. So essentially, the people doing everything, And for them, they require to be taken care of, because without them, there is no prosperity and there is no stability. So as you can see, although there is still a ruling elite, they are very much dependent on those vast majority of society. And then we have the thralls. Now, the thralls are essentially slaves, not necessarily slavery in the way most people understand it in this day and age. The concept of slavery is unfortunately as old as human civilization has existed, but particularly because of the events of, well, how the American continent develops, has been seen and has been, impacted specifically in certain communities like the Black African communities or the natives in America. We have a very specific sort of tunnel vision of how slavery was. But slavery in the Norse society is quite similar than in Roman society. And that means that, you could be a slave for many reasons. You could be a slave because you lost a battle, so you are part of the tribute. You could be a slave because you got in debt and you can no longer provide for society, so someone else has to, provide for you, and as such, you must repay in service. Or it could be, for a variety of other reasons. But those are normally the main reasons: death, war, and potentially a raid. Imagine that you've gone on a raiding party from Ireland to the Mediterranean, and you find some people who you think are exotic, or they are doing a craft that you think is super cool and nobody else has it in, Ireland, you may want to take that person unwillingly for the sake of improving your honor that way. Now, just like in Roman society, it didn't mean that you stayed a slave for life. Slaves that were in slavery due to owning a debt could quite literally pay their debt and then be done with it. You could achieve great honor by doing all sorts of things. And of course, in the kindness of people's hearts, there was also the opportunity for your master to free you. So in that sense, the social mobility of Norse society was a lot more fluid than perhaps later on in time, which is interesting, right, when we think about it. So that's roughly how people worked and how they behaved in traditional societies. And the other thing that was important for these traditional societies, and we've sort of spoken about here and there, was the things. Now, this thing is not like a thing in English. It's written with the thorn in Norse, and it essentially is an assembly. Things were the original community parliaments. And in fact, it is the Norsemen that originate the very first proper parliaments that human democracy, at least in the West, had. So, places like Iceland, places like the UK that have some of the oldest parliaments in the whole world owe that to their Norse heritage. Now, these things could be literally just all the villagers getting together to resolve law making, to resolve conflict, or it could be something a bit more elaborate. Sometimes the law needed to change, and that was also part of what the thing did. So it was something that was very involved, and every single member of the community was encouraged in the measure of possibility to participate. Some people, of course, had more sway than others, but it was supposed to be a fairly democratic process to participate in these things, and everyone was at least allowed to have a voice in that regards. Now, we also think that things, particularly in the earlier stages of the Norse societies, let's say in the earlier Middle Ages, so like from the 5th century to the 7th century particularly, were probably also places for community gatherings, because they were a true essence of the community in that sense. And perhaps around these things, which normally were outdoor places, we may have had ritual ceremonies, festivals, big trading opportunities. So as you can see, they kind of served as a huge forum for the society of that place to come together. But I'm saying this from the point of view of traditional Norse societies, but that doesn't mean all of the Norse societies across the world behave the same way. What about gender? I'll tell you more about that in just a moment. What is your job? Because, like I said, some jobs had more weight than other. If you were a blacksmith, you were important because you were, unlike what most people think, blacksmiths did not spend the whole day doing beautiful swords. Blacksmiths often spend the vast majority of their day doing knives for the kitchen, different utensils for farms to be prosperous. You were super important as a resource, if you see what I mean. What if you were a super wealthy merchant that had traveled the known world and had knowledge? You weren't going to have necessarily the same contribution than other merchants or other craftsmen, if you see what I mean. Ironically, and something that may surprise you quite a lot, is that comb makers, and I mean comb as in for your hair, were precious members of society in Norse context. And you're probably wondering why. Well, the reality is that Norse men and women, and in between, since we have gender fluidity, were actually quite precious about their appearance. And if you remember in Havamal, it tells you how to keep well appearance, but not well. So things about grooming and things like that were very important for them. And having access to those traders was massive. So all of these things matter. And of course, where are you? Because the societies of Northern Norway are not going to be the same than Denmark. Even from the point of view of landscape, we're talking of mountains and fjords with fairly flat land. There are going to be differences. And of course, once you mingle with other cultures, like in the Rus, like in the British Isles, like in Normandy, then there are going to be different dynamics that you absorb with the people that were absorbed into that process as well. So, this is a general overview, but it's not, like I said, a monolith. It's a lot more fluid. The society of the Norse is probably a lot more fluid overall in many ways than other social structures in Europe at the time. And that's something that we see very clearly in women. Not just women, but again, like I said, in the fact that there is a general fluidity about gender that is not as strict as in the rest of other cultures. Now, women specifically, we've spoken about so much in the last few weeks about them that I thought I would tell you more about their role in their communities because, well, women of the Norse communities simply experienced more liberties, independence, etc., than their contemporaries. Fact, period. These women could actually divorce. In the year 1000 and before, Norse women could divorce their husbands for good reason and without having the permission or the validation of the rest of their society. You could divorce your husband because he had a hole in his shirt. Okay, like I'm talking of legitimate reasons as to why someone divorced. There was an investigation, of course, and the thing in this particular situation made sure that there was no foul play and that both parties could not reconciliate whatever, because obviously when you have something like that splitting in a community that depends on its own community, there could be rifts, right? So you need to make sure that you mitigate those issues. But women had that kind of power, which most of our modern societies didn't provide to women until 100 or 200, less than 200 years ago, 150 at best. So very advanced for their time in that case. Now, the majority of the time, women exercised the majority of their power through the family unit. Remember, lineage, honor, all of that matters so much. And women were in charge of keeping that well. They were in charge of the spiritual well-being of their households and communities, of the physical well-being of their households and communities. They were in charge of the farm. Most of the time, it was women, the ones that were aware of when things had to happen, the ones working on the fields 24/7. They were in charge of finances, and they had the keys to the house. So we're talking of a completely different perspective. I hope now you understand why people like Brynhild, Gudrun, Freydis seem to have a bit of an attitude. It's not an attitude at all. They are products of their own generations. Those women had to be on point. Even Havamal tells you, if you want for a good woman, find one that knows how to handle money, find one that has wits, one that will not tolerate your nonsense. These are things that matter in this community because women are essential for society. For the lack of better word, and please do not misunderstand me, men in some cases were seen as disposable. And that comes from a reality of life that perhaps we are not so exposed to in this day and age. But the fact is, life back then was a lot more physically demanding and a lot more exposed to uncertainties. Death was a lot more around them. And for women specifically, that was an issue because even nowadays, childbirth is a complicated thing. Back then, even more so. We have an insane amount of statistics that show the vast majority of women in the Norse period experienced serious issues with childbirth and often died from it. So, if they are your precious resource to keep things going, and they are simply due to the general idea that women also must be providers of life, and to keep communities going, you need new life, they are at risk of dying more than you are, you tend to protect them. That's the reason why they tended to stay in the house and perhaps didn't travel as much as other men. But women were also in charge of businesses. So if you were a merchant, you would go off on business trips. We know that women also fought, perhaps not as much as some Hollywood films and whatnot have maybe led us to believe now, but we have plenty of evidence across the Norse world that women fought, particularly women who were young, who were in their physical prime, who were not married and or had children and therefore were not as precious as those other women, things like that. this was a society that was much more inclusive from that perspective. And that's because gender was not perceived to be as male or female. The concepts of male and female worked in our society only from a biological perspective, as in a woman gives birth because a man doesn't have the physical ability to do so. In Norse society, you were either an active or a passive member of society. And that didn't mean that you were limited. That just meant that your role was slightly different. If you were active, it probably meant you were out there risking your life on a boat trying to steal some gold from some monks, because you had to actively do things that would put you in danger. That's the reason why men of the Norse communities also had such an important, idea around honor and doing things properly, because by being active and being, let's say, the face of everything that happened around their communities, there was a lot of social pressure over them, whether you were a peasant, whether you were a warrior, or whether you were a merchant. And now we're looking into what was like being a man in the Norse communities and in the Viking Age, and it was actually the expectations very different, perhaps, from what we expect from modern days. But the funny thing is that anybody could become an active person, so women could be active. But interestingly, every single man would eventually become passive, because once you get to old age, you're not going to be out there risking your life raiding, or at least not most people. You're not necessarily going to be able to contribute as much to the farm. You're going to have to be, in the backstage. So as you can see, this fluidity allowed Norse society to, well, adapt to their circumstances. So as you can see, some concepts that perhaps affect our modern life now, these people had worked them out entirely different because of their specific circumstances, their environment, their political ideas, etc., etc. And women, in that sense, had much more freedom, also many more responsibilities. But that's why we see so many beautifully bright roles of women in these societies, because the Norsemen were not scared or shy away from their women. They celebrated them because they knew without them, they were doomed. In case anyone needed to hear that today, there you go. Well, now, we've talked about a couple of other things that I wanted to discuss a bit more today. And of course, we've talked so much about exploration, particularly going to America. And the prowess of the Norsemen was thankfully achieved to their technological advancements in shipfaring and shipmaking. Again, this is all entirely because of their surrounding. Consider that the vast majority of Norse colonies are surrounded by water or by the water. When water is a direct, source of life for you, you get real smart about how to get about it. So for the Norsemen, the ships were the height of their prowess, their height of their power, of their wealth, because they were not cheap to build. They were the only way they could succeed in life. Mobility was crucial for them. And everything that allows the Norse ships, the Viking ships, to be, quite frankly, the height of ship technology at that time is the keel and the way the ship was made. All about that keel, because the Norse ships all had a true keel, which you can see here on the edge of the Goskat ship, which is in Norway, by the way. And these were built to be, resilient but slender, and they were clinker built. Now, what is a clinker built? Norse ships were built, as you can see here, with layers of wooden planks. And those wooden planks were riveted together and then covered in tar, which also meant the ships were a lot more flexible, because they were not, dealing with huge chunks of wood trying to float in the ocean. They were flexible, they had more room for movement, and they were easier to repair. Very important. Well, what kind of wood did they use? Originally, we thought that the vast majority of Viking ships used oak, because it's also a tree that we see relatively frequently in their sort of homelands. But as time goes on, they use whatever they can and whatever makes their ships better. And sometimes a combination of wood actually provide to be much more resilient. Different trees have different abilities to adapt to to the weather, to mobility, etc. So again, they were constantly researching these kind of things. And being a boat builder, for example, linking back to our previous slide, was perceived to be super important member of society. Like even if you were of common birth, if you could make ships, you were the boss. Because without the ships, nobody was going anywhere. So it's important. Well, there are two main types of ships, or two main categories of ships that I've put for you guys here. Because often, I think, again, because of the films maybe, or the books, we tend to think of, oh, Viking ships are just one thing. Not at all. They had ships for all kinds of things. But the two main classifications are the canard, which are mostly for cargo, and the longship. Now, with the canard, just so you get an idea of how these ships work, these were ships that were between about 16 meters long. My apologies, I don't know how to convert that into inches or feet, but 16 meters long, and could transport about 24 tons of carrying capacity. That's quite a lot of cargo. And based on modern tests that we've done of them and of the routes that they covered, we reckon these ships could go for about 75 miles on a whole day, which is a fair distance to cover from that perspective. And the best examples of canards that are preserved currently in the world are in Denmark. So if you ever want to see them, or if you have curiosity about it, go and have a look at the Viking Ship Museum in Roskilde. It's just outside of Copenhagen. So that's the one. And then it's the one that most people know about, which is the longship, right? Which is what you have here on the picture on the right. Now, again, longship is just the general word that we used to refer to ships that were long, graceful, and fast for the purpose normally of warfare. They could be used for other things. They could be used for merchant purposes. They could be used for exploration because of the speed, which was important. But normally, the majority of longships had military purposes. And within the longships, we have different types depending on size or carrying capacity, sometimes also depending on the construction. But the most famous one is the drakar, the dragon ship, which were huge ships that could go at 28 kilometers per hour, which I think is 15 knots, if that means anything to you guys in terms of navigation. And those ships actually could carry up to 30 rowing benches or more, meaning, I'm talking of rows where people sat and they started rowing. So, do the math. If you have more than 30 of those lines with guys rowing, you could carry huge crews in those ships. So that's how they actually managed to, be so successful at trading, be so successful at exploration, because the rest of ships that other societies had in Europe at the time were not as versatile as this, and they were not as resilient. To cross the Atlantic, you need something that is fast and light, at least at the time. This type of ship was that. To go up a river and get all the way into the Rhine, you need something that you can move with you. And of course, imagine these ships in the Mediterranean. It was like, we're just to the Baltic and the North Sea. This is quite literally soup for us. That's the reason why the Norse raids of the Mediterranean were so dramatic and so successful, because there was zero complications from the point of view of the weather, etc., etc. So that's why the ships of the Norse changed their fate. And well, finally, since we've spoken about this quite a lot, if manners maketh man, well, weapons maketh heroes, right? We've spoken about Sigurd, we've spoken about the fact that a sword is an item of honor, and I think often we have this idea that every single Viking warrior must carry a sword. And I mean, here is this beautiful display, of course, that gives you different types of swords from the Norse period. But more importantly, shields were the bread and butter of every single warrior society in the Norse colonies at that moment in time, because armor was expensive and also often heavy, and it limited your ability to move. A sword without a shield, with little armor, well, you might as well be asking for death, because you won't get far. So shields are important. That's the reason why the shield wall becomes the sort of key thing we think about the Norsemen, right? But if you think about it, that's the same reason why years later the Normans will develop those beautiful kite shields to keep on developing warfare farther along. So again, we'll talk about those similarities in a few weeks' time in the Normans course. But that's, I think, how most people imagine heroes, right? And warriors. Except that's not true. Swords were not the most common weapon in the Norse societies. I know, big shocker, right? So what were they? This actually, the knife, the common knife, or this one, which is like an upgrade, which is the sax, which is essentially a dagger, are the most common weapons that most people would have had around the house, and one of their most valuable items, which is the reason why the vast majority of Norse burials across Europe have tons of knives. Because it's a weapon of convenience. You use it to peel your potatoes. Well, not that they would be peeling potatoes back then, but if you see what I mean, you use it to peel an apple in the same way that you can use to defend yourself. This was underrated, but it often saved many people. Because again, those shields are designed to protect you against swords. You would lose your weapon during your battle, but you can always keep a handy knife in your boot or in your belt, and that would still give you the ability to survive. And what about axes? Axes, by far, as an actual weapon, the Dane axe, which is what you see here, this is from Uppsala. This is from the archaeological evidence that we have from Uppsala in Sweden. The axe, the Dane axe, and the bearded axe in some places were the most common weapons that most Norsemen used in warfare. Why is that? Because with the axe you can pull shields away from people. And again, who doesn't have an axe hanging around in the house? You need it to chop wood, amongst other things. So I can promise you that the vast majority of Norsemen, unless they were great heroes like Sigurd, carried just a shield, an axe, and a sax, or a spear. Because again, think of the amount of metal that you need to create a spear. You just need this, and the rest is wood. So the sword in Norse society is very much a heroic weapon because it costs a lot of money. It takes a lot of resource and knowledge to make a sword. I don't know if any of you are into metallurgy or if you know anything about just the degree of skill you require to make one of those. But I tell you, making swords is not easy. So if you were able to afford that, if you were able to make that, whoa, you were on a whole different level than the rest of us mortals with our, trinkets from the house. But that is how the vast majority of Norse heroes, of Norse warriors would have actually fought, with ordinary elements that are still part of our modern day society. I mean, I have a knife, a rack full of knives just over there, no much different from what they would have used, 1,000 years ago. So again, I hope that helps you understand that this Hollywood idea of the Norsemen is not necessarily right or what most people during the Norse period would have experienced. And well, we are actually getting to the end of the tour. So I'm gonna put in there the links for you guys for the upcoming tours, as well as the donations through PayPal and Stripe, and then have a couple more things to say. So thing number one, this is what I've decided to put together to give you the tools to carry on doing what we've been doing, but on your own. I think with the mix of sources that we've had with Havamal, with the Volsunga Saga, and the Saga of the Greenlanders, you all now have a better understanding of overall what the Norse narratives are like to dig on your own. But this is some guidance. So particularly for those of you who loved the Saga of the Greenlanders, go and read some of the general sagas of the Icelanders, because they will add layers and they will help you understand things better. But specifically, if you don't know where to start, I suggest these three: Egil Saga, Njal Saga, and Laxdela Saga. Laxdela Saga is my favorite of all time, for sure. And it's because it has very strong female characters, but also because it shows how communities developed in hardship in Iceland in a way that is very humane. The other two are very good as well. Egil's Saga, particularly from the point of view of kind of the expectations of men throughout life and how their life goes on. And Njál's Saga is just such a family drama. Like if you like telenovelas or like, you know, something like that, is literally the precursor to, to what you watch on TV now. Now, Voluspa is a very important poem. It's an Eddic poem. So you can find it in the either on the internet, like we did with Havamal, or in the Poetic Edda. And it's very interesting because it's a poem that will explain more about the Norse cosmos, but also about a very important character in Norse mythology, which is the Volva, a mythical woman-like giant creature that seems to know past, present, and future, and that even great gods like Odin must go to consult in times of need. It's got quite a lot of meta information, but again, if you like the sort of general understanding of the psychology that you read in Havamal, Voluspa will be an upgrade from that. For anyone that just wants to get a better understanding overall, a more round understanding of the Norse, go read the Prose Edda. It's quite thin. It's not even 200 pages, but I suspect with the introduction and the glossary it would be, but it's very easy to read. And the Prose Edda includes a lot of the information that we find in the Poetic Edda, in all of those beautiful poems, but in a way that is more readable, so much more approachable. And then we get to the other stuff that has nothing to do with what we've seen so far. For those of you particularly interested in the East, in the Eastern Norse colonies, particularly in the Rus or in the Volga, go read Ibn Fadlan and the other Muslim chroniclers. Thanks to their proximity to Byzantium and then to the Abbasid Empire, Caliphate even, sorry, the Norse were in contact with a lot of Muslim chroniclers. And the Muslim chroniclers of the early and later Middle Ages are some of the most reliable sources of information we have overall, because in Muslim society at that moment in time, knowledge and written word were very important. They are part of Islam in general, and overall, some of the most important sources of knowledge will come from the courts in Baghdad, in Syria, and actually in the Umayyad Caliphate in Spain, from Cordoba and Seville. So Ibn Fadlan gives a very interesting depiction of how the Norse live around the Volga. I've read it many times, and I think you'll find it quite interesting because as it's written from the point of view of an outsider, I think it also helps you connect as somebody who is not there to see things, if you see what I mean. It's easier to step into that role. So very interesting. But keep in mind that just like with Christian sources, of course, the Muslim chroniclers have their own biases, and you can see, particularly from the point of view of religion, you can see the filter sometimes. But again, it will help you understand how all of these people interacted with each other. Then you have Saxo Grammaticus, History of the Danes, just the first 9 volumes. It's a longer history that narrates past the Norse period. The first 9 volumes are enough for you to understand. And it's pretty much written in the shape of a chronicler. So it's much more, I guess, similar to the type of stories and accounts that we are used to reading in this day and age. And it is done from the point of view of a member of the clergy who actually had knowledge, but acquires the knowledge from the local area. You will find a lot of information about ordinary people. You will find a lot of information about characters you already know about from the last few weeks. So it's a good mix, but it's more like a history book of the time, if you see what I mean. And finally, if you want a completely different take on all of this, go and have a look at Gragas, at the Laws of the Grey Goose. I know, interesting name. This is specifically a volume from Iceland, and that is the collection of all of the laws that are recorded from the 13th century that were discussed at the things. And although I appreciate reading laws may be a very boring thing, I don't suggest you read the whole thing back to back, because I've not done that ever myself. I wouldn't want to impose that kind of pain on anyone. But just selecting random, bits and bobs would get you an idea as to how their society worked, what things require punishment, what things required mitigation, what was legal, what was not legal, what was maybe contemplated but perhaps dangerous. And that would give you a much better idea of what type of court cases and what type of issues day-to-day people had to deal with, specifically to Icelandic society, but we have many, many evidence that show that there were similar laws in other places in Scandinavia. We have similar records coming from Norway, so it seems reasonable to believe not all of them like for like would have applied, but there would have been at least a point of commonality and similarity, if you see what I mean. And that is, well, probably all we have time for today. Yes, I'm just about on topic and on time. So I am just about to open the chat, guys, so you can ask any questions that you may have. So please go ahead, and I will drop in there the links one more time so we can all have them at hand. So if you have any questions or anything that you would like to ask, please go ahead. I just need to drink a little bit of water, so give me 1 second. Do you have a good source to read about Harald Hardrada? Hardrada is difficult, Beverly, because he comes so much later into the game. A lot of the sources that deal with the Norman conquest of England, a lot of English sources during the 11th century give us a fair few details about Harald Hardrada, but overall, it kind of falls a little bit out of the scope here. A lot of the best sources for Harald Hardrada as well come from Norway or Denmark, and they are not always easy to find in English, which could be another problem here as well, guys. Consider that not every single piece of information we have about the Norsemen is translated. So I cannot think of anything right from the top of my head, Beverly, other than, like I said, the direct chroniclers that deal with the Norman conquest of England, because he's one of the contenders. But from a point of view that isn't so skewed, I'll have to get back to you on that. But if you want, I have an archive about this, so I will find something for sure. Paul, oh my God, Frey answer, that's so cute. Is to be enthralled derived from thralls, maybe? I think 100%. In terms of linguistics, there is evidence in there, as with many linguistic terms, there are other contentions. But yes, because, being enthralled is quite literally being at the mercy of somebody else in many ways. So yes, there is a direct link in there, not just from Norse though. There are similar words in other Germanic languages, so there is a clear connection. How do we catch up? Oh, Julie, if you just go to the World Virtual Tours website and you just enter the academy. In fact, I will go to that. I'll go backwards and I'll give you the link for that course. So here, the one at the bottom, if you go through to that link, you will find the ones for this course that you may have missed. So there you go. No worries, guys. Thank you so much. Hollywood movies, and well, Susan, there are some good Hollywood movies that are, there and can be useful, but often the problem is, at the end of the day, most movies just have the desire to entertain, not necessarily to educate, if you see what I mean. So there are gonna be some biases, but like I said, some of them, and particularly as we move into modern age, they are starting to be a lot more inclusive from that perspective. Oh, no worries, guys. Thank you so much. And yes, I hope that you engage with some of this literature for sure. Oh, thank you, guys. It's very, very kind of you. Can you describe Vinland in North American Northman culture? Well, I can only speak from a Northman culture perspective. But Vinland was very much a land for opportunities to get resources from. It was quite difficult to make the journey to be consistent because they had to come all the way from Greenland, and they mostly just wanted the wood, which is what they keep on carrying on. I suspect that if the interaction with the natives would have been a bit more favorable, they would have eventually settled there long term. But other than that, Vinland literally just becomes another land for resource for the Norsemen from that perspective. So in terms of culture, it was like it was no different than raiding season. You were going there for a short period of time and you were coming back home. It was just temporary. 15 knots. Well, thank you. That's I didn't know that. So thanks for I don't know anything about speed or races or whatever. So I'm glad that somebody did because I did not have a clue. So there you go. Christopher, Wall of Shields, did they pick this up from the Romans? Potentially, but actually we're not so sure about that because the Romans probably picked that up previously from the Greek phalanx. And from that perspective, the Greeks are Indo-European people related to the Celts. The only reason why we call some Greeks and some other Celts is just because the Greeks referred to everyone else who was a foreigner up north as Celt. So it's very likely that it's just a technique that has been part of Indo-European societies for quite some time. We don't see lots of mingling and connections between the Northmen and the Romans from that perspective. So I don't think so. And in previous societies of particularly of the Scandinavian North, in the Vendel culture and in the sort of Iron Age, we see it happening. So no link in there directly from that perspective. And yes, the University of the Highlands and the Islands is great. If anyone can get any distance learning from them, they are top notch. And yes, Grey Goose describes the law of Florence, so not necessarily in full lineage, but you will have different laws that are discussed in there, guys. Well, I have less than 1 minute left. So once again, you have in there the links for the upcoming tours. Remember that we will be touring from Malta exactly next week on Saturday, and the links for the donations to keep going with World Virtual Tours. Thank you so much for having been such a joy. Like I said, you're very welcome to get in touch if you have any questions. I'll put in here my email as well. If at any point you want to, message me with any info or any doubts, I am at your service. It's been my absolute pleasure hosting this course. And like I said, if you want to know how those Northmen are going to have an even bigger impact in Europe in just about 100 years' time, I'll be seeing you in a couple of weeks' time for the Normans and their worlds. The first session, it's all about Normandy and those Norse ancestors. And I'll see you there, guys. Take care. Have a lovely rest of your week. Bye-bye.